So welcome to biology class. You were asked on Tuesday to write a short essay on how you would turn a pack of wolves into chihuahuas. I've enjoyed reading your responses to that question, and many of you have done an excellent job. Remember that your responses to two other students, that's due on Friday. And I look forward to looking through those, and we may talk about them when hopefully we meet again on Tuesday. Okay, so let's look at what other people thought about evolution and about changing species. So the other one we're going to really talk about in history is Lamarck, and for some reason his name is missing right here. Let me put it as Lamarck. Lamarck was a Frenchman, and he was the first biologist to propose an evolution. He linked diversity with environmental adaptation. He concluded that more complex organisms are descended from less complex organisms, and he thought that organisms strived for perfection. We find that that's not so much true today. He also proposed that there was He also proposed the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and this is not supported by experimentation. If we take cats and we cut their tails off, they will not have tailless kittens. Kittens will continue to have tails, and you continually to cut them off, and it doesn't help. So Lamarck's hypothesis was that if we have a set of giraffes and they have short necks, but their food is way above them, so they have to stretch their necks to reach the food. And so when they have children, their children have longer necks because the parents stretch their own necks. And so eventually you get giraffes with really long necks. This is not borne out by science. We've not found evidence that if we fix your teeth with a very expensive orthodontia, that your children will have better teeth. It doesn't work that way. Darwin's hypothesis is that originally the giraffe's neck lengths all varied. So we have some with long necks and some with shorter necks. Competition for resources caused the long-necked giraffes to have more offspring. The short-neck giraffe here is dead, so it didn't live to have offspring. And then since the children have longer necks, that happens over successive generations, and eventually you have long-necked giraffes. So let's look more at Darwin's theory of evolution. It's really based on natural selection. Make sure you put in the blank here for hired as a naturalist on the MS Beagle. Let me put I think I can do this and it will show up and then disappear. There we go. There's the Beagle is the ship that he sailed on. He went all around the world, ended up in Galapagos, on the Galapagos Islands off South America. So his theory is natural selection occurs because certain population members have variation, and this allows them to survive and allows them to reproduce. Though there are 4 requirements for natural selection to occur. First, we need to have more offspring made than will survive to adulthood. If all the offspring born to a population survive, there are not enough resources to support the growing population. And Darwin did a little kind of back of the napkin calculation on elephants, because he figured elephants don't reproduce very quickly, right? And he assumed that if you had a pair of elephants in 750 years, their descendants would number about 19 million. So clearly, we produce more offspring than will survive, organisms do. All right. The other thing is that organisms have to vary. Some individuals have to have more favorable traits than others, and that these favorable traits enable them to better compete for limited resources. The next is that organisms differ in reproductive success. So the organisms with favorable traits acquire more resources. They devote more energy to reproduction, and they create a differential reproductive success. The last thing that is required, excuse me, is that variations are inherited by offspring. So you have to have the variations inherited. All right. So a lot of times with Darwin, we hear the survival of the fittest. And so let's define fitness. Fitness is based on the reproductive success of an individual relative to the other members of that population. The most fit individuals obtain more resources and therefore produce more viable offspring. Fitness is influenced by different factors for different populations, and you could add in different environmental circumstances. So warm fur might be a good thing to have if you lived in a cold climate, and so you would survive and you would have babies, whereas maybe a animal with thin fur wouldn't survive and wouldn't have any babies. So it depends on the weather. If you lived in a in a warm environment, that thick fur might be too heavy, and so that might be something kind of a mark against you, and the animal with thinner coat would survive. So evolution is a change in the gene pool of a population over time. And evolution does not occur to an individual, it only occurs to a population. And these changes occur due to mutations. That's gene mistakes. When genes are copied, there are sometimes errors made. Migration, that means some population moving in or maybe a population moving out. Sometimes we have natural disasters that wipe out populations. And lastly, natural selection. Natural selection is the only characteristic here that makes an organism or a population better adapted for its environment. Mutations, migrations, and natural disasters are all random. Natural selection is not random. It depends on the environment. Okay, so organisms become adapted. Adaptation is any evolved trait that helps an organism be more suited to its environment. So my warm fur in a cold environment is an adaptation. Big ears on desert rabbits is an adaptation because it allows the animal to cool off. You can have adaptations that lead to convergent evolution. This is where unrelated organisms living in a particular environment display similar characteristics. So we might have manatees, penguins, and sea turtles, and they all have flippers that help them move through the water, but those animals are not related to each other. Each of those evolved flippers independent of the other. And the adaptations then are a result of the environment and result from natural selection. Differential reproductive success, generation after generation, can cause adaptive traits to increase in the frequency of each succeeding generation. Evolution includes other processes in additional to natural selection. I talked about mutations and migration, but natural selection is the only process that results in an adaptation to the environment. Okay, and we can see selection at work. In fact, people have used selection to breed animals that we find desirable. We breed cows that produce more milk. We make corn that produces more grain or is resistant to some bacteria. Okay, so artificial selection or selective breeding is a human-controlled breeding, and we use it to increase the frequency of a desired trait, like the more grain on the corn or the more milk from the cow, or maybe the dog that we find desirable for one reason or another. Like natural selection, artificial selection is possible due to variations in the population. Variations allow humans to select the traits they prefer. And so we get from wild mustard, we get Chinese cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and this vegetable here. We can also see variation and natural selection occurring naturally, not just artificial selection. The variation in the beaks of the Galapagos finches is due to natural selection, and we find, and I wish I could get the picture up here at the same time, but I'll read this first. The heavy beak is suited to a diet of large seeds. The beak of the warbler finch is suited to feeding on insects, and the longer, somewhat decurved beak and split tongue of the cactus finch are suited to extracting the flesh of the cactus fruit. And here, these three birds, you can see this is a really thick beak, and it can be used to crack open the very toughest of seeds. And this beak is good for seeds, and this one is specialized for eating the flesh of the cactus. We can observe natural selection in a natural setting as well. Peter and Rosemary Grant are famous for their study of the ground finches in Galapagos. And what they did is they have kind of a smallish, medium-sized island, and they have a selection. They have ground finches that live there, and they have gone multiple years and measured the beak thickness of the ground finches, and they find that the beak thickness varies with how wet or dry the year has been. So in a dry year, there are fewer seeds, and to survive, the animals must eat the heavier seeds, the thicker walled seeds that maybe aren't as desirable, but that's what they do. And so after a dry year, the animals that survive have the thicker beaks, and they have babies with thicker beaks. And then the next year, we have a dry year. Again, the thinner beak animals die off, and only the thicker beaked birds survive. And so we get a gradual increase from here to here to here, a gradual increase in the thickness of the beak, and then when we get a wet year, it goes down again. So we can observe natural selection, and we can observe evolution occurring even on our time frame from 77 to 84. Okay, so that's it for this video. Be sure to watch the next one, and I will hopefully see you on Tuesday.